Hello there. Hope you're having a wonderful day, whatever time it is when you're watching this. For me, it's night, so I wish you a good night. It's about that time. Time for a ramble and a cigar, as it so often is the case with me. Now, today's conversation, I want to talk a little bit about a concept which gets a lot of bad press. And that concept is judgment. Judgment. I would expect that the viewer is either under the impression themselves or perhaps understands that the common perception of the word is that it comes with this sort of morally loaded kind of sentiment. Judgment. Wow. Don't be judgmental. It's not good to judge people, or nobody can judge me. Only God can judge me. Or who are you to judge me? All of these different kind of exclamations that people make. And the sentiment is that, either you need a really good reason or you need some position of authority or you need, blah, blah, blah. But judgment, you can't just go judging people, right? And I want to talk about the concept of judgment, and I want to ask the question, is judgment immoral? Is judgment amoral? Or is judgment moral? Or perhaps maybe, do we need to do it? Is it necessary to judge? These are the kinds of conversations that I want to sort of untangle here. And this isn't a particularly big cigar for me, so we'll see how long this goes. Come here, Briar. My cat's already getting started right at the beginning. Come here, buddy. All right. Right at the beginning, we got the cat going. Okay. We'll see how this video goes. So, where should I start? The first question, I think, is to just simply lay the groundwork that most people think that judgment is immoral, that it is wrong to judge, and that it is something that you should strive, if possible, to eliminate from your behaviors and your routines, and that the world would be a better place if people weren't so judgmental. I think that that's probably the normative view. Is that wouldn't things be great if nobody judged? Maybe to one extent you could understand the argument that it is not fun to be judged and that people are always judging with incomplete information. But if you've noticed a theme in my videos, um, I think it's important to remember that you don't get to have complete information. Information is always limited by nature. Um, by nature of you being a perspective bound, time bound creature who has a very limited span here on the earth within which to gather information and data. So your information is always limited. So if that were the case, then it would be necessarily true that nobody would ever be able to judge. at least not in a way that was ethically coherent. And so um, you can understand why this view is popular under those terms and conditions, so to speak. Um, because if nobody's operating on perfect information, then the logic that people are using must be flawed. Thereby, they cannot judge me because they don't know my situation, they don't know my circumstances, all of that kind of logic. And there's a grain of truth to that. Um, the problem is, as I outlined in previous videos, is that you still have to go forward. You still have to make assessments. You have to take risks, and you have to live um, before you're ready to start sometimes. And maybe the same is true for your opinions and your worldviews. Maybe you might have to start before they're fully formulated. Um, and in fact, that is the case. You will have to make adjustments to your worldview and think on the fly and integrate new information and learn. That's part of the human condition. So the same is true for your judgments. When you go and look at somebody else, you'll look at them and you'll say, I have this feeling or I have this viewpoint, and maybe it's predicated on ABC logic. And you go, that's good enough for me. And you make your judgment and you find out later that you were wrong. Well, there's nothing wrong with saying, you know what, I was wrong, right? Like the possibility of being wrong doesn't mean that you don't make judgments, because you have to be able to discern in this life. You have to be able to choose between the forks in the road. And you have to say, that path, I feel like that path is better than the other one. So I'm going to go with that path. And that includes um, judgments that you have of people. You may have to say at certain times, I think it's time for me to switch which road I'm on and go a different way, because I'm starting to see a pattern over here. I'm starting to believe that this character trait might be present, or whatever the case. You don't need it in your life, etc. So you switch paths. Now, the interesting thing about a value judgment is that when you make such a judgment, you're looking at your limited information and you're saying, I have to pick, I have to make this decision with my incomplete information. And that's actually what makes it a judgment. It's a value judgment instead of a value observation, or, a value truth. Excuse me. That's actually what causes that to be the case. That's why it has to be a judgment, because you're looking at the information that you have present as you understand it, and you're saying, I think this, I'm going with this. It's actually what a judge does in a court of law. They say, given the evidence, I think that this is the case, and then this is my judgment, this is what's going to happen, right? So that's what judgment is. Excuse me, I'm sorry. I have a bit of, I don't know if it's allergies or whatnot. I'm sure somebody who's watching the video will let me know that it's the cigar. And I'll be sure to quit immediately. So you have to make these value judgments. You have to decide in the moment whether you think something is more or less valid. And you have to go with it, just like a judge does in a court of law, because, the case is time bound, but so is your life. So at some point, you just have to make your judgment and go. And so allow me to try to make the case that judgment is um, not really optional. So, despite the fact that judgments can be painful to receive, and that they can open you up to sort of a form of bias, I guess you could say. Despite all of those things being true, there's nothing you can really do about it. And I'm going to use sort of a comical um, metaphor to try to explain how this might be the case. So let's say you're laying in bed, right? You're asleep. And you're woken up by one of the most annoying things in the world to be woken up by. And the thing that wakes you up is the urge to relieve yourself to go take a piss. And you wake up and you say, ah, fuck, I'm going back to sleep. This is stupid. Because of course, sleep is what you were doing. Sleep is what you valued, right? In that moment. So of course you're going to go back to it. And you're tired anyway. Your body's like barely awake at all. I'll just go back to sleep. Let's raise our hands in the audience. How many of us go back to sleep the first time, or try to go back to sleep the first time when you have to urinate in the night? I do. I don't know anybody who would say they don't. I'm sure there's some psychopath out there that just pops out of bed and does it, but I think most of us are tired and we want to keep sleeping, so we try to go back to bed first. And, sometimes that might work for a little while. You might get another hour, you might get half an hour, you might get a couple minutes. You may even occasionally sleep through the night. But most of the time that this happens, your first value proposition, your first value judgment of what you should do about the stimulus that you're receiving from your own body, but you're still receiving the stimulus nonetheless. Your first value judgment is sleep would be better than going to the bathroom and dealing with this. And so you try to go back to sleep. That's a value judgment. Is that I think this is better than that. I'm going with this. And then almost invariably, what ends up happening is you just cannot kick the urge. You have to get up and go at some point. And it could be 2 times you try to fall asleep, 3 times, 4 times, 5 times, 7 times, 8 times, 20 times. Depends on how tired you are. Depends on how bad you have to go. And so you're sitting there and you're trying and trying and trying. And at some point you go, God damn it. Let me just get up and go to the restroom and deal with this problem I have. And so you do it. And that is an example of your value judgment not aligning with reality, the real value. And the real value was you had to deal with that. And until you dealt with that, it wasn't going to go away. That's where the reality of it was. Hey, little honey. You're so cute. Yeah, but there will be a cigar. As long as you know that. As I've said in a previous video, this one is not the biggest fan of cigars, so she may stay with us for a time. She may decide it's not worth it and leave. We'll see what she thinks. She is being very cuddly and sweet today, so she may stay with us. I'm sorry if you're hearing noise from her tail. And so you make the value judgment, you make the value assessment. You turn out to be wrong. What that means is that your value judgment was not correct. You adjusted, you went and used the restroom, and then you dusted your hands of it, you reintegrated, and you moved on. Okay, so you can be wrong with your value judgments. It's not the end of the world. As long as you update to what a more accurate model of what the value actually is. And you can go back to sleep afterwards. That's the interesting thing about that example. It's not like you don't get to sleep. You just have to deal with this problem first, which is coming from reality. It's not something that you get to ignore. So that's all fine. So that's an example of how in these moments you have to make a judgment because you're faced with contradictory potentialities, but contradictory. Um, you're faced with a fork in the road. You can't take both paths at once. You got to pick one. Or I guess toddlers do sometimes take both. They do take both of the forks in the road in that one. Sometimes you'll have a kid just piss the bed, right? Because the kid can't decide between getting up and using the restroom and just urinating. They don't even necessarily know that such a thing is wrong. And it will take years and years and years of trial and error and value judgments before they realize that they're not allowed to do that, and it doesn't work in society, which is just a more complicated version of the same thing we just talked about. And so, you make these value judgments, they turn out to be true or false. Turn out to be right or wrong is maybe a better way to phrase it. And then you integrate, you upgrade, and then you move on. When you're meeting a new person, for example, you may have this feeling that, their character might not be what you're looking for in terms of a friend or perhaps a romantic partner. And so you go, well, I don't know. I don't think this person and I are going to get along. You have to make a judgment of their character. And you don't get to not do that. You are going to do that. You absolutely will have feelings and opinions about their character, and you will judge them. There is no doubt about this. It is going to happen 100%. And the thing is, this is the irony, and this is where the conversation gets very interesting. If you were talking to somebody and you said, hey, you're too judgmental, is that not a judgment? It is a judgment. You've judged that I am too judgmental. So now you're judgmental. So you enter the judgment paradox, where you can't call someone judgmental without being judgmental. It's a very interesting problem. And what this means from a logical perspective is that judgment is actually an axiomatic component of the human experience. It is built into being a human that you will and must judge. You will and you must discern. It is simply not possible to live your life without judging things. You're doing it constantly. You're doing it right now. As you're listening to these arguments, every argument I ever make, you will have to judge whether or not it's a valid argument. You'll have to assess the truth claim. Okay. That's good to know because you can't live your life without judgment. And so, to tie this back into the beginning of the video, judgment is not, it's not optional. That doesn't answer the question of whether or not judgment is moral, amoral, or immoral. But it does answer the question of whether or not you have to do it. And the answer is you do have to do it, and you will do it. No matter what you think. It doesn't matter if you like it. You are judging everything all the time. So now on to the question of whether or not judgment is immoral, amoral, or moral. And the answer is that it's contextual. It depends to what end you're judging. Depends why you're doing it. You're going to have to measure the outcomes of your judgments to see. That's the short answer. But built into this concept is the idea that because judgment is a necessary component of human beings, and that you have to do it to live, What this means is that in terms of being a human, in terms of living your life and living it well, because judgment is necessary, then to get good at the skill of judging things is moral. So you need to practice judgment and you need to practice how to do it in order to integrate it into your system so that it becomes a moral good in your life. Instead of, your judgment being dominated by, let's say, maybe your emotions or your impulses. For example, every time you eat a candy bar, when you do it, implicit in the action is the claim that eating the candy bar is better than not eating the candy bar. Okay? Implicit in the claim of smoking the cigar is the claim that doing it is better. Implicit in the claim of drinking this beer is the notion that doing it is better than not doing it, right? And in some ways, my assessment of those circumstances is wrong. And this goes back to my first video, which I uploaded. Because I don't have all the information, I'm definitely making mistakes. But because I'm living, I'm making value propositions and I'm making value judgments. And then reality will have to check me and tell me whether or not I'm on the right path. And then I'll have to integrate and update to a better model. So, judgment is inevitable. As a human being, you must judge. You will judge. It doesn't matter if you like it or not. You're going to do it. It's an axiomatic component of living as a human. But also embedded into action, everything you do contains a value proposition. So, for example, when you're in the bed, you're making the value statement that going back to sleep is better than going and using the restroom and solving the problem. So there you are. You're stuck in this position where you have to make judgments, you have to act them out. And even if you're not aware that you're doing it, you are doing that anyway. So I don't remember which philosopher said it, but one of the great philosophers in history said, to live is to err. And that just breaks down into you're going to mess up, but you don't have a choice because you're alive and you have to make decisions and you have to act, but you're definitely going to mess up. It's true. Pardon me if you can hear any of that. I'm sorry. I'm probably not going to make any edits to this video. I'm just going to upload it quick and dirty. That's how I like to roll. So we get the premise. So judgment can be a moral good if you practice it and you get good at it and you figure out, why certain conclusions are being caused by certain things, and you start to get more sophisticated in your judgments, and you start to get more accurate in producing the outcomes you're looking for. And so judgment can become a very moral thing. I think when people are talking about judgment being bad and how you shouldn't judge people, what they're really saying is, don't just tear people down, right? Don't just try to degrade people's morality and make them feel bad about themselves and attack their self-esteem. Don't do that pointlessly. Don't do that aimlessly. At least try to be a little considerate for how people are feeling. And I completely agree with that. I don't think that anyone should be torn down for no reason. But I also don't think that it's accurate to say that that's the functionality of judgment, that that's the core of what it means to judge. I don't think that's accurate at all. A judge doesn't hand out a prison sentence for the sole purpose of hurting somebody's feelings, right? They're trying to administer justice. They're trying to get the right answer and make society move in a better direction, let's say. At least if we're, you know, being kind with the way we talk and think about it. At least that's ostensibly what they're trying to do. So we've established that, there's a way to judge someone that's immoral, but nobody's really advocating for it. And there is a way to judge that is moral, and nobody's really talking about that either. Nobody's really advocating for that either. No one's defending the concept of judgment. And the product of this is that people get very aimless and they get very defenseless and they don't know how to deal with a circumstance where they encounter something that they actually don't like, that they think is bad for them. They get very paralyzed and defenseless and they don't know how to stand up for themselves because what they've been taught their entire lives is don't judge. Judging is wrong. So they come into contact with these people or these events, or circumstances which are potentially harmful to them. And instead of using their cognitive powers, analyzing the situation, and then just taking the product of that work and saying, I do think that this is the case and I'm not going to tolerate it. Instead of simply doing that, they say, no, 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 I'm not judging you. And that gets people in a lot of trouble, man. We have a culture full of people who are basically, acting like they don't have a right to have thoughts. They don't have a right to look at something and decide for themselves whether they want to be a part of it or whether they support it. And they're just being shamed and bullied into just forfeiting before the conversation even starts. And so as we roll into the end of the cigar, I want to basically tell you that you can advocate for yourself. The fact that you judge is not only inevitable, it's necessary. You couldn't live without judgment. You know, don't torture people with it, don't bully people with it if you can help it. But also, don't be weak. You should be able to stand up for yourself and you should be able to have a hard conversation where you tell people aspects, perhaps not the totality, but elements of what your judgment are that might be constructive, that might help the person that you are judging grow. You know, people love to talk about, the patriarchy and things like that. Well, you know, if we're going to use terms like that, we're going to talk about it. I would like to just say that judgment, in some sense, in my view, or at least in the view of ancient people and historians and psychologists and things like that, not all, but most, is that judgment is kind of a masculine trait. And so the people who would be most affected by being told not to judge would be men in that case. Telling people not to judge would be usually told to a man, not always. But, you know, men should be able to judge. They should be able to judge for themselves. They should be able to think about things and make assessments and move forward based on the data and the information and the ideas that they come up with. There's nothing wrong with productive and constructive judgment. That's actually one of the primary ways that you make progress when you identify an issue, which is a judgment. You're saying, I have noticed a problem or I have noticed a circumstance which I think could be better off ameliorated. And then you say, okay, I'm going to work towards that. Now, the decision to work towards that comes after the judgment. The judgment comes first. It's hiding inside the observation. And so to kind of tie in the previous two videos I've done into this one, you have the axiomatic element of freedom of will, which I still haven't proven, but I'm just going to assert. You have the axiomatic element of faith, and you have the axiomatic element of judgment. And these are fundamental cornerstones of being a human. I'm sorry if you heard that too. You cannot live your life without freedom of will, faith, and judgment. It is not possible. You will be an incomplete person. And to the extent that you're fighting against either one of these, you're not living. You're not living properly. You cannot be a masculine man and ignore those three things. You know, So when you become the pure act that I talked about before, which is the highest elevation of faith and the maximal elevation of freedom of will and the Venn diagram in which they overlap, you need to be able to figure out what it is that you're going to aim at and what you're going to do. And the way that you do that is judgment. And your judgment can be about material substrata. It can be about your feelings. It can be about problems you need to solve. It can be about a business that you're working on. It can be about art. It can be about anything. Your judgment can be about anything. And you have to have the balls to say, this is my assessment. This is what I'm discerning from this, and I'm going with it. And no one can bully me out of this before I figure out what the answer is. You might be able to say, I hadn't thought of that. I'm going to integrate that before I even run the experiment. That's fine. You can make a value judgment that your previous value judgment wasn't complete enough, and you can base that off of feedback that you got from somebody else. That doesn't argue against the concept that it's still a judgment in both cases. And so, what I would like you to walk away from today is that judgment is neither, it's not moral, it's not amoral, and it's not immoral. It can be all three. Probably it's value charged when you judge. I mean, kind of intrinsically by the nature of it. So it's probably either moral or immoral. But because it's necessary, you have to do it. You can't not do it. It doesn't actually matter if it is, it's not the right question if it's moral or amoral. The question is, given that I will judge, how can I do this in an ethical way? How can I be a good actor in the way that I judge? And so, what we should be attacking as a culture and a society is not whether people judge, it's more like how they judge and why they judge. Those are better questions than whether to judge because you can't not judge. It's impossible. In the case of the child who decides, I'm not getting up, I'm going to go back to sleep, but I'm also going to urinate in the bed. In the case of the child who does that, the question is not, was that, is that judgment good or bad? The question is whether the outcome of the judgment was good or bad, right? So, like, peeing in your bed as a child isn't good. It's not good for your parents. It's not good for you. It's a bad habit. You got to fix it. And so the question isn't whether or not it was a good judgment. The question is, what was the outcome produced by that? And what would you need to have thought in order to produce a different outcome? And so you teach people how to think as opposed to what to think, which is always better. hmm So what I would love for you to do is to think a little bit about ways that you might be judging right now and whether the product of those judgments is making your life better or not. Again, I'm going to encourage you to utilize the mind of an engineer and test it instead of trying to think about what's true. Is it true that judgment is good? Is it true that it's bad? Wrong question. Does judgment make my life better? Does it make it worse? In what ways? How should I integrate? How should I change? You got to be at least attempting to move towards betterness. And with that, I'm getting very, very tired, and I'm almost at the end of my cigar and almost at the end of my Modelo. So it was a joy talking to you today. I'm going to wrap things up and get headed to bed, but I'm going to encourage you to think about judgment. Think about the ways that you have to do it in your life, what kinds of outcomes you might be able to produce, whether or not they're helpful or beneficial to you. And I will see you in the next one. Thank you so much for watching. Have a great night. Bye bye.